A homeless veteran used his last $5 to claim a broken diner everyone else had abandoned. Then a deadly blizzard sealed the mountain roads, cut the power, and drove dozens of frightened neighbors toward that forgotten building. Ethan Walker owned little more than a worn-out backpack, a loyal German shepherd named Shadow, and one crumpled bill. Buying the Iron Mesa Diner looked like the most reckless decision of his life. He could not yet know that a secret beneath its kitchen floor had been waiting for someone willing to keep the doors open when the world turned cold. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The truck stop sat alone beside a long stretch of highway in southern Wyoming. The kind of place travelers barely noticed unless they were desperate for gas, coffee, or a few hours of sleep. The neon sign above the building flickered in the cold night air, buzzing like a tired insect. Beyond the parking lot stretched miles of dark prairie and distant hills, all of it swallowed by a sky heavy with winter clouds. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly over rows of plastic chairs. Ethan Walker sat in the far corner near a vending machine that hadn't worked in years. His shoulders were hunched inside a faded army jacket that had seen too many winters. In his right hand, he held a crumpled $5 bill. He had been staring at it for nearly 10 minutes. The paper felt thin between his fingers, soft from age and handling. It was the last money he had. $5. Not enough for a motel room. Not enough for a proper meal. Maybe enough for a stale sandwich from the gas station cooler down the road. Ethan turned the bill over slowly, as if another look might somehow change its value. It didn't. At his feet, a large German shepherd lifted his head. Shadow's ears twitched at the faint rumble of a diesel engine outside. The dog was big, his coat dark and thick, streaked with patches of silver along the muzzle that hinted at age and hard years. One ear bore a small notch from an old injury, and a faint scar ran along his front leg. Shadow watched Ethan with calm, intelligent eyes. Then he rested his head gently against Ethan's boot. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're still here," he muttered. Shadow's tail gave a slow, quiet thump against the floor. Most people would have given up by now. Ethan knew that. But when he came home from Afghanistan 2 years earlier, the plan had been simple. Find a job. Find a place to live. Start over. But plans had a way of falling apart. The memories came first. Loud sounds made his heart race. Sudden movement made his hands shake. Some nights he woke up convinced he was back in the desert, hearing explosions that didn't exist. The doctors called it post-traumatic stress PTSD, a tidy little phrase for something that felt like your mind was still trapped in a war, long after the war had ended. Employers didn't understand it. Landlords didn't tolerate it. One failed job became 3 short-lived jobs, and then none. The apartment went next. After that came weeks of sleeping wherever he could. A shelter in Cheyenne, a borrowed couch in Casper, and finally this truck stop, where nobody asked questions as long as you stayed quiet. Outside, a semi-truck roared past on the highway. The sudden sound made Ethan's body tighten instantly. For half a second, his mind was somewhere else. Dust, heat, the metallic crack of gunfire, a blinding flash. Ethan blinked hard and forced himself back to the present. Shadow nudged his leg again. "I'm good," Ethan said quietly, but his voice sounded thin. He rubbed a hand over his face and leaned back against the cold wall. Across the room, a television mounted near the ceiling played a muted news broadcast. The subtitles crawled along the bottom of the screen while the anchor spoke silently about weather warnings somewhere in the Midwest. No one else seemed to be watching. A trucker slept with his hat pulled low over his eyes, and another man hunched over a laptop near the coffee machine. Otherwise, the room was empty. Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked along one corner, but it still barely worked. The truck stop offered free Wi-Fi, though free mostly meant slow enough to make a person lose patience. Ethan opened a browser anyway. He had already checked job boards twice that night. Nothing nearby. Nothing he could get to without a car. Still, he kept scrolling. Habit? Hope? Maybe both. Shadow shifted slightly, resting his chin on Ethan's knee. The warmth helped. Ethan scrolled past ads for apartments he couldn't afford. Used trucks that cost more than he had earned all year. Farm jobs hours away. Then a county auction page appeared. He almost ignored it, as government auctions usually meant seized cars or old office furniture. Things nobody wanted anymore. But one listing caught his eye. The picture loaded slowly. It showed a small roadside building sitting alone beside a two-lane road. A diner. The kind built decades ago with wide windows and a flat roof trimmed in chrome. The paint was faded, and weeds had taken over the parking lot. Above the entrance hung a crooked sign. Iron Mesa Diner. Ethan leaned closer to the screen. He read the description beneath the photo. Abandoned roadside diner, Pine Hollow County, Montana. Starting bid, $5. Sold as is. Buyer must claim keys in person. Ethan blinked. Then he read it again. $5. The same amount he was holding in his hand. That cannot be right, he murmured. Shadow lifted his head slightly, as if reacting to the change in Ethan's voice. Ethan tapped the screen and opened the listing. The details were short. Former diner, closed 20 years. Property maintained by county for tax purposes. Structure condition, unknown. Starting bid, $5. No inspection available. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Montana. He had never even been there. The distance alone made the idea ridiculous. He glanced down at the $5 bill again. $5 could not buy a future, but it could buy a chance. The thought crept into his mind slowly. Then it stayed. What do you think? He said quietly. Shadow tilted his head. Ethan gave a dry laugh. Yeah, I know. It sounded insane. A diner nobody wanted in a town he'd never seen hundreds of miles away. But then again, what exactly was keeping him there? A broken chair in a truck stop, a phone without a service plan, and one $5 bill? Shadow shifted closer, pressing his side against Ethan's leg. The dog's presence was steady, grounding. Ethan looked at the listing one more time. His thumb hovered over the bid button. If someone else had already placed an offer, the price would climb. The idea would end there, but the current bid still read $5. No other offers. Ethan felt something strange stir in his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile. This was something quieter. A stubborn refusal to disappear. He looked down at Shadow. You pulled me out of a blast once, Ethan said softly. The memory flashed through his mind. A patrol route, a buried explosive, the deafening crack that turned the world white. When Ethan woke up in the dust and smoke, Shadow had been dragging him by the vest away from the wreckage. The dog had refused to leave him. Ethan reached down and scratched the thick fur behind Shadow's ear. Well, he said slowly, maybe this is our next bad idea. Shadow's tail thumped once. Ethan stared at the screen. Then he pressed the button. The page refreshed. Winning bid recorded. Payment due when the keys were claimed. For a moment, he simply sat there. Nothing changed. The room still smelled faintly of burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. Outside, another truck rolled through the night. But somewhere in Montana, an abandoned diner now had an owner Ethan Walker and his dog. Ethan looked down at the $5 bill in his hand. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to a smile. "Guess we're heading north," he said. Shadow stood, ears alert, as if he had been waiting to hear those words. Ethan folded the crumpled bill and slipped it back into his pocket. Outside the window, the highway stretched into the darkness. A long road, but for the first time in months, it felt like it might lead somewhere. Ethan Walker stood outside the truck stop just before sunrise, the cold Wyoming air biting through the thin fabric of his jacket. The horizon was turning pale gray, the first hint of morning stretching across the endless prairie. Trucks rumbled past on the highway, their headlights cutting through the dim light like silent comets. Shadow stood beside him, alert and calm. The dog's breath rose in faint clouds. Ethan checked his phone again. The confirmation email was still there. County auction notice. Winning bid, $5. Property, Iron Mesa Diner. Location, Pine Hollow County, Montana. Buyer, must claim the keys within 14 days. 14 days. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "I guess that makes it official," he said. Shadow flicked his ears. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked north. Though he couldn't see Montana from here, just miles of highway and frozen land. He had no car, no savings, and now apparently owned a diner hundreds of miles away. He almost laughed. The only thing crazier would have been someone bidding $6, he muttered. Shadow nudged his hand again. The dog had a way of doing that whenever Ethan started drifting too far into his thoughts. "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "We should probably figure out how to get there." Inside the truck stop, the coffee machine finally sputtered to life as a clerk unlocked the counter. Ethan stepped back and warming his hands near the heater vent. The smell of burnt coffee and frying eggs filled the small building. The same trucker who had been sleeping earlier was now finishing breakfast. Another pair of drivers walked in, stamping snow off their boots. Normal morning routines. For a moment, Ethan felt like a ghost moving through someone else's life. Then, Shadow sat beside him, tall and steady, a reminder he wasn't alone. Ethan approached the counter and asked whether they could spare a cup of hot water. The waitress studied his worn jacket, poured him a plain coffee instead, and waved away the crumpled bill. Then she glanced at Shadow. "Is the dog allowed in here?" He is a trained service dog," Ethan said. After retiring from military work, Shadow had been retrained to interrupt Ethan's panic episodes and guide him through crowded places. The woman shrugged. "Well, he is quieter than most folks who come through here." Ethan gave a faint smile and carried his plain coffee to a seat near the window. His mind worked through the problem. Montana, no car, and hundreds of miles of winter highway. Then he heard two truckers talking near the door. One of them mentioned Billings. Ethan stood. "Excuse me, are either of you heading toward Montana?" The older driver looked him over. "Close enough. I am hauling through Casper, and then west. I can ride quietly," Ethan said. "So can the dog." The driver studied Shadow, who sat perfectly still beside Ethan's leg. Then the man grinned. "That shepherd behaves better than my brother. Grab your things." Ethan let out the breath he had been holding. "I appreciate it." An hour later, they were rolling north on Interstate 25. The cab of the semi-truck smelled like diesel and peppermint gum. Country music played softly from the radio. Shadow lay between the seats, watching the road through the windshield. Outside, Wyoming unfolded in long stretches of pale grass and distant mountains. For a while, Ethan simply watched the road. The movement felt strange after weeks of standing still. Miles passed beneath the wheels. The sky brightened. Then, a metal chain clanged somewhere in the trailer behind them. The sharp sound snapped through Ethan's mind like a rifle shot. His body reacted instantly. His hands tightened. His breath shortened. Dust, gunfire, shouting. For a moment, the cab disappeared, and the desert returned. Ethan's vision blurred. A heavy weight pressed against his leg. Shadow. The dog had already moved, pressing his body firmly against Ethan's side. Warm, solid, real. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed slowly. The trucker glanced over. "You all right?" "Yeah," Ethan said after a moment. The driver nodded like he understood more than he said. "My brother came back from Iraq like that," he muttered. They drove the rest of the morning mostly in silence. By afternoon, the land began to change. Mountains appeared along the horizon. Tall pines replaced open prairie. The air grew colder. By the time they reached Casper, snow had begun to fall lightly. Ethan climbed down from the truck, stretching stiff legs. "Thanks for the ride," he said. "No problem." The driver looked at him once more. "You got somewhere to be?" Ethan thought about the diner, about the $5 bid, about a place he had never seen. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I do." Another truck heading toward Montana picked them up outside a gas station that evening. Then another. The next morning. Piece by piece. Mile by mile. The road carried them west. The Rockies rose higher each hour. Snow covered the slopes. Dark forests filled the valleys. Shadow seemed to grow more alert the deeper they went into the mountains, watching every passing ridge like he recognized something in the land. By the end of the second day, Ethan finally saw the road sign. "Welcome to Pine Hollow County. Population 912. The truck dropped them near a small gas station at the edge of town. Before walking farther, Ethan stopped at the county office, signed the as-is transfer papers, and placed his crumpled $5 bill on the clerk's desk. In return, the clerk slid a worn envelope across the counter. Inside waited a brass key and a warning that the county guaranteed nothing. Not the roof, not the plumbing, and certainly not the future. Pine Hollow looked exactly like the kind of place highways forgot. A single main street, a few old brick buildings, a feed store, a mechanic shop, snow piled along the sidewalks. People moved slowly here. It looked as if time carried less urgency. Ethan slung his backpack over his shoulder. Shadow walked beside him, tail low but steady. He pulled his phone out again and opened the auction listing. The address led out of town, along an older highway. 2 miles later, the trees opened into a wide clearing, and there it was, Iron Mesa Diner. The building stood alone beside the road, surrounded by a cracked parking lot where weeds poked through frozen asphalt. The chrome trim along the roof had dulled with age, and the once bright neon sign hung crooked over the entrance. Iron Mesa Diner. The letters were faded, but still readable. Snow rested along the edges of the roof. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there. After everything, the truck stop, the ride north, the endless miles, this place was real. Shadow stepped forward first. The dog sniffed the air carefully. Then he looked back at Ethan, as if to say, "Well." Ethan walked toward the door. The key envelope from the county office felt heavy in his pocket. He slid the brass key into the lock. It stuck for a moment, then turned. The door creaked open slowly. Cold air drifted out. Dust floated through beams of gray daylight from the windows. Inside sat rows of red booths, a long counter, and metal stools that hadn't been touched in years. The entire diner looked frozen in time. Ethan stepped inside. Shadow followed close behind. Neither of them knew yet that beneath their feet, hidden under the kitchen floor, waited something that would change everything. The door of the diner creaked shut behind them with a hollow echo. For a moment, the building was completely silent. Dust hung in the air, like thin gray fog, drifting slowly through beams of pale afternoon light that slipped through the wide front windows. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the walls, carrying the distant whisper of pine trees from the mountains. Ethan Walker stood just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust. The place smelled old, not rotten, just forgotten. He stepped forward slowly. His boots left faint marks in the thin layer of dust covering the black and white tile floor. The pattern of the tiles was worn, but still visible, like the bones of something that had once been alive. Rows of red vinyl booths lined the windows. Some of them had cracked seams, where the stuffing inside had pushed through. A long counter ran along the right wall, with a row of chrome stools still standing exactly where customers had left them decades earlier. The diner looked less abandoned than paused, like everyone had simply walked out one day and never returned. Shadow padded forward quietly, nails clicking softly against the tile. The dog's nose moved constantly, taking in every scent. Old grease, metal, dust, something faint beneath it all. Ethan walked toward the counter. A faded menu board still hung above the kitchen pass-through. Burgers, $2.10. Coffee, 50 cents. Cherry pie, $1.25. Ethan gave a faint smile. I guess inflation had not caught up yet, Ethan said. Shadow wagged his tail once. Ethan rested his hands on the counter and looked out through the front windows. The view surprised him, but the diner sat along an old stretch of highway that curved gently through a valley surrounded by pine-covered hills. Snow rested along the roadside, and the distant Rocky Mountains rose like silent giants beyond the tree line. It was quiet, really quiet. Not the empty quiet of a city alley at night. This was the deep quiet of open land, where the wind and trees were the only things speaking. For someone like Ethan, who had spent years surrounded by the noise of war and highways and crowded shelters, the silence felt almost unreal. He turned back toward the kitchen. Let us see what we bought for $5. The swinging door into the kitchen groaned when he pushed it open. The room beyond was smaller than he expected. A long stainless steel prep table sat in the center. Rust-speckled refrigerators lined the back wall, and a large industrial stove stood beneath a vent hood that had collected decades of dust. Old coffee mugs still hung from hooks near the sink. Shadow walked ahead, sniffing every corner. Ethan moved slowly through the room, opening cabinets and checking drawers. Utensils, pots, boxes of yellowed napkins. Everything looked like it had been left exactly where it was. He opened the refrigerator. Empty. He checked the freezer. Empty. The pantry shelves held only a few forgotten cans whose labels had faded beyond recognition. Nothing exciting yet, Ethan murmured. Shadow suddenly stopped. The dog's ears lifted sharply. Then came the sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Shadow began pawing at the floor near the back wall. Ethan turned. What is it? Shadow barked once, short and sharp. Then he scratched again at the tile. Ethan walked over. The spot Shadow had chosen looked no different from the rest of the floor at first glance. But when Ethan crouched down, he noticed something strange. A faint outline in the tile. A square shape. He brushed some dust away with his sleeve. Metal. A thin seam ran around the edge. Ethan frowned. Hold on. He grabbed a nearby wrench from the prep table and slid the tip carefully under the edge. The metal plate shifted slightly with a dull clunk. Shadow barked again. Easy, Ethan said. He wedged the wrench deeper and pulled. The plate lifted. Beneath it sat a heavy steel hatch with a recessed handle. Ethan stared at it. What in the world? The hatch looked thick. Military thick. Like something built to survive more than just time. A strange feeling crept up Ethan's spine. Shadow stepped closer, nose almost touching the metal. The dog whined softly. Ethan gripped the handle. The metal was cold. For a moment, he hesitated. He had opened enough doors in his life that led to things better left alone. But curiosity pushed him forward. He pulled. The hatch lifted slowly with a long groan of hinges that hadn't moved in decades. A dark stairwell appeared beneath it. Cold air rose from below, carrying the faint smell of metal, old oil, and dry concrete. Ethan grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Concrete steps led downward. The walls were reinforced with steel panels. This wasn't a simple basement. This was something else. Shadow stepped forward without hesitation. "Hey," Ethan said, but the dog was already descending the stairs. Ethan sighed. "I guess we're doing this." He followed. The stairwell turned once, then opened into a wide underground room. Ethan stopped at the bottom. The light from his phone swept slowly across the space. Rows of shelves, boxes stacked neatly, metal cabinets, water containers, medical kits. The room was enormous. A bunker. Not merely a storm shelter, but a fully stocked survival bunker. Ethan's breath caught. Shadow moved deeper into the room, sniffing quickly between the shelves. Ethan walked forward slowly, shining the flashlight across the supplies. Canned food, emergency rations, blankets, fuel containers. Even a large generator mounted near the far wall. Everything was carefully organized, as if someone had prepared this place for a very long wait. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "This is insane." He moved toward a metal desk in the corner. A thick notebook rested on top. Its leather cover had aged but remained intact. Ethan opened it. The first page held a name written in neat, steady handwriting. Colonel Samuel Whitaker, United States Marine Corps. Retired. Ethan froze. The name felt familiar. He flipped through a few pages. The notebook was a journal. Entries dated back nearly 30 years. Most described the construction of the bunker, supplies, maintenance, plans, but one line near the top caught Ethan's eye. "If you are reading this, it means the diner has found a new guardian." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Shadow suddenly barked again from the far side of the bunker. The dog stood near a wooden crate, his nose pressed against something inside. Ethan walked over and opened it, and inside lay a small metal box. Military issue. Ethan lifted the lid. His breath caught. Inside were several medals and a worn military patch. An older version of the Joint Task Force insignia Ethan had worn in Afghanistan. It did not mean Whitaker had served beside him. The dates made that impossible. But it meant their service had passed through the same military lineage, separated by decades. Ethan stared at it, unsettled by the small bridge between two soldiers who had never met. How was that even possible? Shadow sat beside him quietly. The bunker felt different now. Not merely hidden, but connected, as if the place had been waiting for someone like him. Ethan closed the metal box slowly. Above them, the diner creaked softly in the mountain wind. And somewhere deep, in the silent valley of Pine Hollow, the story of Iron Mesa Diner had just begun to wake up. Ethan Walker stood in the middle of the bunker for a long time, the metal box still resting in his hands. The beam from his phone drifted slowly across the room again. Rows of supplies, shelves stacked with canned food, medical kits, sealed in plastic, fuel containers, labeled with dates that stretched back decades. Someone had built this place with purpose, not panic, with preparation. Shadow moved quietly between the shelves, his nose brushing along the edges of boxes, as if he were inspecting the bunker, like a soldier, checking equipment. Ethan looked back down at the patch inside the metal box. It carried the older insignia of the command, under which his battalion had later served. He had not seen that symbol since Afghanistan. A strange weight settled in his chest. "What were you building down here?" "Colonel," he murmured. The journal on the desk suddenly felt more important as Ethan walked back to it and flipped through several pages. The handwriting was steady and disciplined, military, neat. Entry after entry described supplies being added to the bunker, fuel reserves, water purification systems, and medical inventory. Near the back, newer pages showed that Whitaker had continued replacing fuel, filters, sealed rations, and medical stock until the winter before his death. The diner had been closed to customers for 20 years, but the shelter beneath it had never truly been abandoned. Every few pages, the journal drifted into something more personal. Whitaker wrote about the town, about Pine Hollow, about people who might one day need shelter when the world outside failed them. One line caught Ethan's eye. "A soldier prepares not for the crisis he expects, but for the one that comes." Ethan closed the journal slowly. "I guess you believed something bad was coming," he said quietly. Shadow trotted back toward the stairs and looked up. The dog gave a soft bark. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Let us see the rest of the place." They climbed back into the diner when the afternoon light had shifted while they were underground. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, turning the sky pale gold. Dust floated through the quiet dining room. For the first time since arriving, Ethan walked through the diner with different eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a place someone had protected, prepared, and preserved. He stepped behind the counter and wiped his hand across the old surface. The dust smeared into a clean streak. "I could probably still serve coffee here," he muttered. Shadow hopped onto a booth seat and watched him. Ethan wandered through the diner slowly. Behind the kitchen, he found a small office. A rusted desk sat near the window. Inside the drawers were old receipts, faded photographs, and a yellowing newspaper clipping taped to the wall. Iron Mesa Diner celebrates 20 years. The photo showed a much younger Samuel Whitaker standing proudly outside the building. Beside him stood several townspeople, children, families, workers. The diner had once been the heart of this place. Ethan stared at the photo for a moment. Then he folded the clipping and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. The mountains had turned purple in the fading light. Shadow suddenly jumped down from the booth and moved toward the door. His ears stood alert. Then came the sound. A car engine. Ethan froze. The vehicle slowed as it approached the diner. Tires crunched against the cracked pavement of the old parking lot. Ethan stepped outside. A black SUV rolled to a stop near the front entrance. The engine shut off for a moment. Nothing moved, but then the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She looked to be in her early 30s, dressed in a dark winter coat that probably cost more than everything Ethan owned. Her boots crunched on the snow as she walked toward him. Her posture carried confidence, control, the kind of person used to being listened to. Shadow moved beside Ethan. Instantly, the dog's body stiffened slightly. The woman stopped a few steps away. Her eyes moved over Ethan quickly. His worn jacket, his backpack. Then, "Shadow, you must be Ethan Walker," she said. Her voice was calm, but cold. Ethan nodded slowly. "That depends. Who is asking?" The woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. She held it up. Victoria Whitaker. The name landed heavily. Ethan recognized it immediately. Whitaker, the same name Ethan had seen in the bunker. "My grandfather owned this diner," she continued. Ethan crossed his arms. "Owned?" Victoria gave a thin smile. "Yes, owned." She stepped closer and handed him the paper legal documents and property records. Ethan scanned the page. I bought the place through the county auction, he said. Victoria nodded. Yes, you did. Her smile faded. Ethan felt the calm he had found earlier begin to tighten. So what are you saying? He asked. Victoria looked around the diner. Her expression carried more disappointment than anger. The county classified this property as abandoned while my grandfather's estate was still being reviewed. My family is challenging that classification in probate court. As much as I appreciate your enthusiasm, she continued, the property may still be legally tied to the Whitaker estate. My attorneys have requested a temporary possession order. Ethan folded the document carefully. And what does that mean for me? It means you may have to leave. The words landed like a cold wind. Shadow gave a low growl. Victoria glanced at the dog, but did not step back. I plan to sell the land, she said. A renewable energy company wants to build a solar field here. Their offer is $600,000. Ethan stared at her. $600,000. The number felt unreal against the cracked windows, crooked sign, and dusty booths. This diner has been closed for 20 years, Victoria added. Honestly, I am surprised anyone bothered bidding on it. Something shifted inside Ethan. Not the explosive anger he remembered from the war, but something slower and heavier. You said the case is still being disputed, he said. Yes, the next hearing is in 30 days. 30 days? Victoria turned toward the SUV. I strongly recommend that you do not spend money repairing this place, Mr. Walker. It may not be yours for long. She opened the driver's door. The engine started. The SUV backed out slowly onto the road. Then it disappeared down the valley. The silence returned. Ethan stood there for a long time. Shadow sat beside him, watching the empty road. 30 days. Ethan turned slowly toward the diner. Behind the quiet walls of the building, beneath the kitchen floor, the bunker remained hidden, prepared, waiting. Shadow looked up at him. Ethan scratched the dog behind the ear. Well, he said quietly, I guess we just got ourselves a fight. The wind rolled gently down from the mountains, brushing through the tall pines beyond the road. Snow shifted across the cracked parking lot in thin, drifting lines. Ethan Walker stood outside Iron Mesa Diner for another moment, watching the empty highway where the black SUV had disappeared. 30 days. That was the clock now, 30 days before lawyers and paperwork could erase the only thing that had felt remotely like a second chance. Shadow sat beside him, eyes still fixed down the road. The dog's ears twitched slightly as the wind changed direction. Ethan let out a slow breath. Well, he muttered again. Softer, this time. Nate, standing here won't fix anything. He turned back toward the diner. The building looked different now. Not abandoned, but threatened. Inside, the quiet returned as soon as the door closed behind them. Dust still hung in the air. But Ethan began to notice details he hadn't before. The layout of the room, the solid structure of the counter, the wide windows that looked out across the valley. Under the dust and neglect, the diner had good bones. Shadow padded through the room again, sniffing corners like a patrol dog checking a perimeter. Ethan walked behind the counter, found an old rag beneath the sink, and wiped a section of the countertop clean. Then another, then another. The red vinyl of the nearest booth slowly emerged from beneath the gray film of time. Let's see if the town remembers this place, he said quietly. An hour later, Ethan and Shadow were walking down Pine Hollow's Main Street. The town was small enough that the entire downtown area fit within 3 blocks. A grocery store, a mechanic's garage, a feed supply shop, and a small diner that appeared to be the only place currently serving food. The sign outside read, Alvarez Market and Cafe. Inside, the warm smell of soup and fresh bread wrapped around them the moment they stepped through the door. Several customers glanced up. Small towns notice strangers. A woman behind the counter wiped her hands on an apron and smiled. She looked to be in her late 50s, with silver threaded through her dark hair and kind, watchful eyes. "Well now," she said, "that is a fine dog." Shadow sat automatically beside Ethan. "He behaves better than I do," Ethan replied. The woman laughed. "I am Maria Alvarez. What can I get you?" "Just coffee." Maria poured a mug and slid it across the counter. "Passing through Pine Hollow?" Ethan hesitated. "Actually, I just bought the Iron Mesa Diner." The spoon in Maria's hand stopped moving. "You bought it?" "County auction." "Well, I will be." Two older men at a nearby table exchanged glances. One of them rose and walked over. He wore oil-stained coveralls and carried the faint smell of engine grease. "You the fellow who bought Whitaker's Diner?" he asked. "That is right." The man extended a hand. "Frank Dalton." "Ethan Walker." Frank glanced down at Shadow. "Good-looking shepherd. His name is Shadow." Frank nodded approvingly. "Colonel Whitaker loved dogs." Ethan's attention sharpened. "You knew him?" Everyone in Pine Hollow knew Sam Whitaker. Frank pulled over a chair. "That diner used to be the center of town." "Oh." Quote, I am. Maria leaned against the counter. Truckers stopped there every morning. Students came in after school. Half the town ate breakfast there at one time or another. "Sam built it in the late 70s after he retired from the Marines," Frank said. "Why did it close?" Frank's expression softened. Sam got older. Traffic moved to the new interstate, and Pine Hollow got quieter. Eventually, he locked the doors. "But he never sold it," Maria added. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. "His granddaughter says she is taking it back." "Victoria?" Frank gave a low whistle. "That will be interesting. She came through last year talking about selling the land," Maria said. "To a solar company," Ethan replied. Frank shook his head. Sam would have hated that. "Why?" "Because he always said the diner had another purpose." Ethan felt the hidden bunker beneath his thoughts. "What purpose?" Frank tapped one finger against the counter. "He never explained. He only said that one day the diner might save lives." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Shadow rested his chin on Ethan's knee. Frank studied the way the dog watched the room. "Military trained?" Ethan nodded. Frank looked at Ethan's posture, his jacket, and the careful way he sat, with his back protected by a wall. "And you served too?" It was not a question. Ethan did not answer, and Frank did not press. Instead, the mechanic stood and reached for his coat. "If you are planning to repair that place, you will need tools." "You offering?" Frank grinned. "I run the only mechanic shop in Pine Hollow. I have enough spare equipment to rebuild a small town." "Hi." Maria laughed. "And if Frank does not scare you away, I will send food. Support." The word felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, but Ethan let it settle. Frank glanced toward the door. "Sheriff Reed usually drives by around sunset. I will tell him the diner has a new owner." "The sheriff?" "In a town this small," Frank said, "the sheriff is practically the welcome committee." Outside, the evening light was already fading when Ethan and Shadow walked back toward the diner. The mountains were turning dark blue against the sky. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Across town, Shadow trotted ahead for a moment, then turned back toward Ethan. For the first time since arriving, the valley didn't feel empty. It felt connected. Behind them, Pine Hollow's few lights began to glow. Ahead of them, Iron Mesa Diner waited quietly in the fading light, and beneath its floor, the bunker remained stocked and silent, prepared for a day when the town might need it again. Night settled slowly over the valley of Pine Hollow. The mountains darkened first, their tall ridges turning into black silhouettes against a sky that glowed faintly with the last light of sunset. Cold air rolled down through the pine forests, carrying the quiet sound of wind through branches. Inside Iron Mesa Diner, Ethan Walker pushed open the front door and stepped back into the dusty silence. Shadow followed, tail low, but steady. For a moment, Ethan just stood there. The diner felt less empty now, not alive yet, but awake. He set his backpack down near the counter and rubbed his hands together. "All right," he said quietly. "Let us see what we can do with this place." Shadow trotted toward the kitchen, already sniffing the floor like he had earlier. Ethan grabbed the same rag he'd used that afternoon and started cleaning again. Dust came off the counter in thick gray streaks, while each pass of the rag revealed more of the diner's old shine. The chrome edge of the counter slowly reappeared. The red vinyl booths began to look almost respectable again. Ethan worked steadily, cleaning, moving chairs, opening windows to let the stale air escape. Outside, the sky darkened completely. By the time he finished wiping the last table, the only light in the diner came from the flashlight on his phone. Shadow returned from the kitchen and sat beside him. Ethan scratched the dog's neck. "You know," he murmured, "this place might actually work." Shadow thumped his tail once. Ethan walked to the front window and looked out across the valley. The highway stretched quietly through the trees. No traffic, no headlights, just silence and snow. A faint glow of lights from Pine Hollow flickered in the distance. For the first time since the war, Ethan didn't feel like he was passing through somewhere. He felt like he had arrived. But that thought didn't last long. Headlights appeared on the road. A sheriff's truck approached slowly, tires crunching across the snow-dusted parking lot. A tall man in a heavy coat stepped out and walked toward the diner with calm, measured steps. Shadow rose at once. "You, Ethan Walker?" the sheriff asked. "That is me, Mason Reed." They shook hands. Reed's grip was firm without being aggressive. "Frank Dalton told me you were in town," he said. "News travels fast here. In Pine Hollow, news usually arrives before the person it is about." Ethan almost smiled. Reed looked toward the diner. "I have not seen lights in this place for 20 years. I am working on that." The sheriff's expression grew more serious. "Victoria Whitaker called my office. Let me guess. She wants me gone. She wants the property secured until the legal dispute is settled." "And what do you want?" "I enforce the law," Reed said. "For now, the county auction paperwork is valid. Unless a judge says otherwise, you can stay." Ethan released a quiet breath. Reed studied the building. "Sam Whitaker was a friend of mine." "You knew him?" "Everyone did." "Did you know about the bunker?" Reed's eyebrows rose. "The what?" Ethan nodded toward the kitchen. "You should see it." A few minutes later, the sheriff stood beneath the diner, sweeping his flashlight across shelves of sealed rations, water tanks, blankets, medical kits, and the old generator. "Well, I will be damned," he murmured. "This place could keep dozens of people alive for weeks. That is what it looks like." Reed crouched beside Whitaker's journal and read several lines. Then he closed the leather cover with care. "That stubborn old Marine," he said softly. "He always claimed the diner had one last job to do. I thought it was just an old man refusing to let go." They climbed back upstairs. Outside, the wind had strengthened and the temperature had fallen sharply. "You check the weather?" Reed asked. "My signal comes and goes." The sheriff pointed toward the mountains. "A major storm is moving in." "How bad?" "The worst forecast we have seen in years. If the models are right, the temperature could fall to 35 below zero, and the roads may disappear before midnight." Snow began to drift across the lot, light at first, then thicker. Reed glanced toward the kitchen floor. "That bunker may save lives before this night is over." He walked back to his truck, then paused with one hand on the door. "You staying here?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." "Then the diner may get its first customers sooner than you expected." The truck disappeared down the road as snow began to swirl across the parking lot. Ethan closed the diner door and stood beside Shadow at the front window. "Looks like Whitaker knew something we did not," he said. The mountains vanished behind thickening clouds. The wind came first. It rolled down from the Rocky Mountains, like something alive, rattling the windows and pushing snow sideways across the road. Within minutes, the old highway began to disappear. Shadow sat beside Ethan, ears forward, body alert. The dog had shifted into the posture Ethan knew well. Working, watching, ready. The clock above the counter read 7:12 p.m. "We should prepare the bunker," Ethan said. Shadow followed him into the kitchen. Ethan opened the steel hatch, climbed below, and switched on the generator. The machine answered with a low, steady rumble. Electric lights flickered across the shelves. He checked the water tanks, fuel gauge, food stores, blankets, and medical supplies. Everything matched Whitaker's maintenance notes. The old colonel had not built the shelter halfway. He had built it to endure. Ethan nodded slowly. "This will work." Above them, the diner's front door slammed against the wall. Ethan froze. Shadow's head snapped upward. Voices. Ethan climbed the stairs. Wind roared through the open doorway as Frank Dalton and Maria Alvarez stumbled inside, their coats crusted with snow. Frank forced the door shut behind them. "The storm arrived faster than expected," he said, fighting for breath. Maria clutched a canvas bag filled with bread, soup cans, and coffee. "Sheriff Reed told us about the bunker. Power is already out across half the county," Frank added. As if the storm had been waiting for those words, the diner lights flickered and died. Only Ethan's flashlight remained. "How bad will it get?" Maria asked. Ethan looked toward the open hatch. "Bad enough that we should move now." Within minutes, the three of them were below ground. Frank stared at the reinforced walls, generator, water tanks, and carefully labeled shelves. "Good Lord," he whispered. "Sam really finished it. He maintained it until the winter before he died," Ethan said, showing him the newer journal entries. Maria ran one hand along a shelf of blankets. "Then let us make it useful." The wind hammered the diner roof. A vehicle horn sounded somewhere outside. Shadow was already moving. Ethan followed him upstairs and pulled open the front door. Snow struck his face like sand. Through the white haze, he saw a man struggling across the parking lot with a barely conscious boy in his arms. "Over here!" Ethan shouted. The man staggered through the doorway. "Our power went out. The furnace stopped. Sheriff Reed told us to come here." Ethan helped him steady the child. Down the kitchen stairs. Maria is waiting. More people arrived during the next hour. A pickup truck slid sideways into the lot, carrying 3 elderly neighbors. A young couple came on foot, with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Sheriff Reed brought 2 families in his truck, then returned to the road until the drifts became too deep to risk another trip. Each time the door opened, the blizzard tried to enter with them. Shadow remained near the entrance, barking whenever movement appeared through the snow and guiding people toward the light. By 9 o'clock, more than 20 residents had gathered in the bunker. Maria organized food and warm drinks. Frank inspected the heating system and generator. Sheriff Reed counted people, checked names, and used the last of his radio signal to direct anyone still mobile toward the diner. The underground room filled with low voices, nervous breathing, and the rustle of blankets. For the first time, Whitaker's hidden shelter was serving the purpose for which it had been built. Then Shadow stiffened. He turned toward the stairs and barked sharply. Ethan followed him into the diner. Visibility outside had fallen to only a few yards. Somewhere beyond the doorway, a pickup horn blared twice and stopped. A small figure appeared through the snow. A boy was running blindly toward the diner lights. Before Ethan could reach him, the child slipped beside a deep drift and vanished. Shadow bolted forward. The German shepherd plunged into the snow and began digging. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him. Beneath the powder, the boy's coat had snagged on a jagged sheet of ice. Shadow gripped the back of the jacket without touching the child's skin. Ethan freed the trapped fabric, and together they pulled the boy into the open. "Dad," the child gasped. A man stumbled from the stalled pickup, shouting his son's name. Ethan lifted the boy and led both of them into the diner. Downstairs, Maria wrapped the child in blankets while Sheriff Reed checked his breathing and circulation. The boy began to shiver, a frightening sight, but also a hopeful one. Shadow returned more slowly. Blood darkened the fur above his front paw where hidden ice had cut him. Ethan knelt beside the dog and opened one of Whitaker's medical kits. "You all right, soldier?" Shadow leaned against him, tail moving once, while Ethan cleaned and bandaged the wound. By the time the entrance was secured again, 40 people had gathered beneath Iron Mesa Diner. Children slept beneath blankets. Adults whispered in small groups. Snow pounded the roof like distant artillery, but the concrete walls did not move. Frank sat beside Ethan and looked around the shelter. "You realize what this means?" he asked. Ethan kept one hand on Shadow's shoulder. "What?" "If this place had not been here tonight, Pine Hollow would have lost people." Ethan looked across the room. Families, neighbors, the sheriff, Maria, moving from person to person, and Shadow, lying beside him injured, exhausted, and still watchful. Above them, the blizzard continued to rage. Below it, the bunker held. For the first time in 20 years, it was full. The bunker beneath Iron Mesa Diner hummed with quiet life. The generator's steady rhythm blended with breathing, whispers, and the rustle of borrowed blankets. 40 people, families, neighbors, children, and elderly residents now occupied the shelter Samuel Whitaker had built decades earlier. Outside, the storm had erased the highway and the mountains. Inside, warmth held. Ethan sat against the metal wall near the ladder, watching the room. Years in the military had trained him to count, assess, and notice small changes before they became dangerous. Frank Dalton sat nearby with a cup of coffee Maria had warmed over a portable burner. "Never thought I would see this bunker full," Frank said. "Whitaker probably hoped nobody ever would," Ethan replied. The boy Shadow had pulled from the drift, slept beneath 2 blankets, his breathing steady. Sheriff Reed moved quietly among the residents, keeping track of names and medical needs. Maria checked every child and older neighbor as if the entire town had become her family. Shadow lay beside Ethan, with his injured paw bandaged. The dog's body rested, but his attention did not. Every time the wind struck the diner harder, one ear lifted. Ethan scratched behind Shadow's ear. "You did good tonight." Shadow's tail moved once, then both ears snapped upright. A low growl formed in his chest. "What is it?" Shadow stood and stared toward the stairs. He barked once, sharp and urgent. The room fell silent. Ethan climbed the ladder and opened the hatch into the kitchen. Wind pressed against the building. Somewhere outside, faint and irregular, a vehicle horn sounded through the storm. Sheriff Reed joined him at the front window. For several seconds they saw nothing. Then a pair of dim hazard lights blinked through the blowing snow, several hundred yards down the old highway. Ethan recognized the black shape beneath them, Victoria's SUV. Reed swore under his breath. "How far?" Ethan asked. 300 yards, maybe less. It may as well be 3 miles in this wind. Anyone trapped inside would be losing heat fast. Ethan looked back toward the bunker. 40 people depended on the generator, the shelter, and the sheriff's calm presence. But someone was freezing beyond the diner lights. Frank appeared at the foot of the stairs. What happened? Victoria Whitaker is stranded on the road. Frank's face hardened. The woman trying to take this place? Ethan did not answer. Shadow stood beside the hatch, ready despite the bandage on his paw. War had left Ethan with many wounds, but it had also left him with one rule he could still trust. No one gets left behind. I am going, he said. Reed caught his arm. You step into that whiteout without a line. You will never find the diner again. Then give me a line. I should go with you. No. The people downstairs need the sheriff here. Reed hesitated, then nodded. Take Whitaker's 500-yard rescue rope. Clip it to the harness, not your waist. Anchor the other end to the steel porch rail. There is a folding rescue sled beside the medical cabinet. Frank handed Ethan a heavy parka. Bring yourself and that dog back. Ethan secured the rope to a climbing harness, wrapped a scarf across his face, and unfolded the lightweight sled. Shadow waited at the door. You stay close, Ethan told him. The door opened, and the storm struck like a wall of ice. The rope uncoiled behind Ethan as he pushed into the white darkness. Shadow moved beside him with his nose low, following scent, sound, and training. Each step sank deep into drifting snow. The wind stole breath and direction, but the taut line behind them remained a path home. After several minutes, Shadow barked. The SUV emerged from the storm, half buried against the roadside. Ice sealed the doors. Victoria slumped over the steering wheel, pale and barely responsive. Ethan used the emergency hammer to break the rear passenger window, cleared the glass, and unlocked the vehicle. He shielded Victoria's face, pulled her free, and secured her to the rescue sled beneath 2 insulated blankets. Shadow circled once, then turned toward the direction of the diner. All right, Ethan said through the scarf. Take us home. They followed the rope back 1 step at a time. Ethan hauled the sled while Shadow moved ahead, checking the route whenever drifting snow buried the line. Twice, Ethan fell to one knee. Twice the dog returned and pressed against him until he stood again. At last, the diner's exterior light appeared as a pale glow through the storm. Reed and Frank rushed out, clipped themselves to the porch line, and helped pull the sled inside. Minutes later, Victoria lay in the bunker near the heater vent. Maria removed her wet outer layers, wrapped her in dry blankets, and placed warm water bottles near her torso. Color returned slowly to Victoria's face. Ethan sank against the wall beside Shadow, too exhausted to speak. The room remained quiet. Everyone understood what had happened. The man whose claim to the diner was being challenged had risked his life to save the woman leading that challenge. Outside, the blizzard remained merciless. Inside, something in Pine Hollow had begun to change. Snow hammered the roof like waves against a ship. 40 people rested on folding cots, crates, and blankets beneath the concrete ceiling. Ethan sat near Whitaker's journal, his shoulders aching from hauling the sled through the storm. Shadow lay beside him with his injured paw stretched across a folded blanket. The bandage showed a faint stain, but the bleeding had stopped. Even while resting, Shadow's ears twitched at every new sound. Ethan leaned back against the wall. For a moment, the quiet felt almost peaceful. Then Maria spoke. She is waking up. Victoria lay on a narrow cot near the heater vent, surrounded by blankets. Her eyes opened slowly. She stared at the unfamiliar concrete ceiling, then tried to rise. Maria pressed a gentle hand to her shoulder. Easy. You nearly froze. Victoria looked around at the shelves, generator, sleeping families, and rows of emergency supplies. Then she saw Ethan. You, she whispered. Ethan walked over. Your engine died several hundred yards, down the road. We brought you here. And her eyes moved toward Shadow and the bandage around his paw. He pulled a boy from a snowdrift before we found you, Ethan said. It has been a long night for him. Victoria took in the room again. Frank stood nearby. Sheriff Reed watched from the opposite wall. Maria held out a cup of warm broth. Dozens of people Victoria had never met were alive because the diner had opened its doors. "What is this place?" she asked. "Your grandfather's project. My grandfather did not build a bunker." Frank gave a tired chuckle. Sam Whitaker built plenty of things he never discussed. Ethan lifted the leather journal from the metal desk. "You should read this." Victoria opened the worn cover and found her grandfather's name written on the first page. She turned through construction drawings, supply lists, maintenance records, and notes about Pine Hollow. The farther she read, the quieter she became. At last, she discovered a folded envelope between two pages. Her name was written across the front. Victoria opened it with trembling hands. The paper had yellowed, but Samuel Whitaker's writing remained clear. She read aloud, "Victoria, if you are reading this, the diner has found someone new to watch over it. I built this place neither for profit nor inheritance. I built it for the people who might need shelter when the world turns cold." The bunker fell silent. Victoria continued, "The purpose of this diner belongs to the person who protects it when the time comes, not to the person who merely claims it by name. If someone stands here in the storm and opens the door for others, trust that person as the rightful guardian of Iron Mesa." Her voice faltered. She lowered the letter. Frank cleared his throat. "That sounds like Sam." Victoria looked at Ethan. The cold certainty she had carried into the parking lot was gone. "You saved these people," she said. "The bunker did most of the work." "No." She looked at the sleeping families. "A bunker cannot choose to open its door." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I found this place by accident." A faint smile touched Victoria's face. "Perhaps that is how some people find the place they are supposed to protect." Sheriff Reed stepped closer. "What happens to the court challenge?" Victoria folded the letter carefully. "The estate authorized me to pursue it, which means I can end it. When the phone lines return, I will instruct my attorneys to withdraw the claim and confirm the county transfer." Frank blinked. "Just like that?" "Not just like that." Victoria looked around the shelter. "Because of this. End. Tinda. End. Then she faced Ethan. "The diner belongs to the man who stood in the storm." Ethan did not answer. The weight of the words settled through the bunker. Shadow rested his head on Ethan's boot. For the first time since the war, Ethan felt something he had almost forgotten. Not merely relief, but belonging. The people of Pine Hollow settled again. Children slept first, followed by the older residents. The generator hummed beneath the quiet breathing of the town. Victoria remained near the desk, rereading her grandfather's letter. It no longer looked like part of an inheritance. It looked like a set of instructions. She had finally understood. Frank stretched his stiff legs. Sam Whitaker always did have a flair for surprises. Maria smiled. Perhaps the old Marine planned all of this. Sheriff Reed shook his head. Maybe he simply trusted that the right person would arrive when the time came. His eyes moved toward Ethan, who pretended not to notice. Outside, the storm grew even louder. The bunker lights flickered once, then steadied. Frank looked toward the generator. "Holding? For now." Ethan knelt beside the machine and checked the fuel level, temperature, and exhaust pressure. Whitaker had chosen reliable equipment and maintained it carefully. Frank crouched beside him. "You handled yourself well out there." "I followed the rope." Frank glanced toward Shadow. "That dog followed more than rope." Ethan looked at his partner. Shadow's eyes remained fixed on the bunker entrance. "You two been together long?" Frank asked. "Since Afghanistan." Frank nodded. "My brother worked with a K-9 overseas. Some bonds do not end when the orders do." Ethan said nothing, and Frank understood enough not to ask more. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Snow climbed halfway up the diner windows. Reed's radio offered nothing but static. Across the county, the power remained down. Maria served warm broth. Victoria helped carry cups between the cots. It was the first time Ethan had seen her smile without calculation. Small, tired, and real. At 3 a.m, the lights flickered again. This time, they dimmed long enough to silence the room. Frank listened to the generator. That is not good. The machine sputtered, recovered, then began to strain. Ethan checked the gauges and traced the problem to the air intake. Blowing snow and frozen condensation were choking the exterior vent. "Can you fix it?" Frank asked. "I have to clear the pipe from outside." Reed stood. "I will go." "No," Ethan said. "The people here need you." Frank folded his arms. "And I am not letting you vanish into that storm alone." Shadow rose and limped toward the ladder. Ethan sighed. "Apparently, I already have a volunteer." He wrapped the dog's bandage with a waterproof layer, clipped himself to the porch safety line, and pulled on the heavy parka. Maria caught his sleeve. "Be careful." Victoria looked at him. "You have already saved enough people tonight. Do not make us rescue you next." Trest 12. 12. 12. 12. To selve. To selve. To selve. To selve. "I will do my best." Ethan opened the hatch. Wind burst through the diner, carrying a wave of snow across the kitchen floor. Outside, the world was white. The roof groaned beneath the weight of the storm. Ethan followed the building wall toward the generator vent, while Shadow stayed close, protected from the deepest drifts by the narrow overhang. The intake pipe was half buried beneath hard-packed snow and ice. Ethan dug with a shovel until his shoulders burned. The cold numbed his fingers through his gloves. Each time he paused too long, Shadow barked once, urging him to keep moving. "I hear you," Ethan said through the scarf. At last, the shovel struck metal. Ethan cleared the pipe and broke the ice from the vent with the handle. Air rushed through the opening. The generator's rumble strengthened inside the building. Ethan leaned against the wall, dizzy with cold and exhaustion. Shadow pressed hard against his leg. "Move." The command needed no words. Ethan pushed himself upright and followed the safety line back to the door. Frank pulled them inside and slammed it shut. Below, the lights brightened. The generator returned to a smooth, steady rhythm. Frank grinned. "You fixed it." "Whitaker built good equipment," Reed chuckled. "And Pine Hollow found a good mechanic." Ethan sat beside Shadow. The dog leaned against him, exhausted but satisfied. Sometime before dawn, the storm began to weaken. The violent pounding softened into long gusts. Snow still fell, but no longer with the same fury. Morning approached the mountains slowly. Reed climbed the ladder first and opened the hatch. Cold air spilled down the stairwell, clean and sharp, rather than violent. "It is passing," he called. Ethan followed him into the diner. Shadow came behind, moving carefully on the bandaged paw. Pale light filled the dining room. Snow had climbed halfway up the windows, and the parking lot had vanished beneath deep drifts. Beyond the glass, blue openings appeared between the clouds. Ethan pushed open the front door. Pine Hollow had been transformed. Roads, trees, fields, and rooftops lay beneath a white silence. The mountains shone in the first sunlight. Sheriff Reed stepped beside him and looked across the valley. "We made it." Behind them, the people of Pine Hollow climbed from the bunker one by one. Frank stepped into the dining room and whistled. "That is a great deal of snow." Maria tightened her coat. "But everyone is alive." That mattered more than anything. Children gathered at the windows. Adults stretched stiff limbs after a night underground. Footprints crossed the dusty floor. Chairs had been moved, and blankets rested across the booths. The diner no longer looked abandoned. It looked used, needed, and awake. Victoria climbed the ladder last. She stood beside Ethan at the front door and studied the white valley. "My grandfather used to say storms reveal the truth about people," she said. Ethan looked toward the families behind them. I suppose he was right. Frank carried a shovel outside. "If we intend to send everyone home, we had better start digging." Soon the parking lot filled with activity. Sheriff Reed divided the adults into teams. Maria served coffee from a large metal pot. Laughter slowly replaced the fear of the night before. Even the children carried small buckets of snow away from the doorway. Shadow limped outside and settled beside the entrance, watching the work. Ethan knelt beside him. "You have earned some rest." The dog leaned gently against his shoulder. Victoria approached with her grandfather's letter folded in both hands. "I meant what I said downstairs," she told Ethan. "As soon as phone service returns, I will withdraw the estate's challenge and confirm the county transfer." Frank called from across the lot. "About time." Victoria ignored him with the patience of someone beginning to understand small-town humor. "I would also like to help restore the diner," she continued. "You do not owe me that. I know. But this place should do more than survive one storm. It should live again." Ethan looked at the building, the people clearing snow, and Shadow guarding the doorway. He remembered the old photograph of Samuel Whitaker standing proudly beneath the Iron Mesa sign. "I think that is what your grandfather wanted." Sheriff Reed walked over, brushing snow from his coat. "County plows should reach us by afternoon." He looked at Ethan. "You planning to stay in Pine Hollow?" The faded sign still hung crooked above the door. Snow clung to the chrome trim, but the diner no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a beginning. Shadow barked once. Ethan smiled. "Yes, I think we are staying." Victoria handed him the letter. "My grandfather wrote this for the person who protected the place. That was not me." Ethan accepted it carefully. Sunlight spread across the mountains. The storm had nearly buried Pine Hollow, but it had uncovered something the town had almost forgotten. Courage could be quiet. Community could begin with one open door, and a man who believed he had nothing left could still become someone others depended upon. Reed studied the diner. "Funny thing about storms," he said. "What is that?" Frank asked. "They show you which buildings are strong enough to stand." He nodded toward Iron Mesa. This one passed. Shadow's tail moved slowly as the town returned to life. Beside him stood Ethan Walker, no longer wondering where the road would carry him next. The road had brought him home. Winter loosened its grip on Pine Hollow over the following weeks. County crews reopened the roads. Power returned. Snowbanks slowly withdrew from the storefronts and fields. But the town did not forget the night Iron Mesa Diner became a shelter. Truckers began stopping to see the old roadside building with the hidden bunker. Residents volunteered lumber, paint, tools, wiring, and labor. Victoria paid the outstanding legal and inspection costs from the estate. Frank repaired the roof and kitchen equipment. Maria tested recipes and declared most of Ethan's coffee-making ideas a danger to public health. 6 months later, the diner opened again. The parking lot had been leveled. Reinforced windows faced the valley. The restored neon sign glowed red above the old highway. Inside, polished red booths lined the windows. Chrome shone beneath warm lights. Coffee, bacon, and fresh bread filled the room with the smell of ordinary life. Maria ran the kitchen most mornings. Frank handled repairs. Sheriff Reed arrived near noon every day and insisted his repeated visits were official inspections. The bunker remained stocked, inspected, and ready. It became the center of Pine Hollow's emergency plan rather than a secret beneath forgotten tiles. The diner also became a gathering place for veterans passing through the region. A small room behind the office offered a shower clean clothing, a telephone, and help contacting local services. No one had to explain everything before receiving a meal. Ethan stood behind the counter one afternoon, drying coffee mugs. Shadow rested at his feet. The wound on the dog's paw had healed, leaving only a narrow line where the fur had grown back unevenly. He had become a local hero, though he accepted attention with the solemn patience of a retired soldier. He never moved far from Ethan. Victoria entered, carrying a folder. "You are getting busier," she said. Two truckers laughed near the window. Ranchers shared a table beside the counter. An elderly couple split a slice of cherry pie beneath the restored menu board. "Not bad for a $5 investment," Ethan replied. Victoria placed the folder before him. "The foundation paperwork is complete." He opened it. Iron Mesa Veterans Relief Fund. The new charity would support veterans facing homelessness, isolation, and the difficult journey back into civilian life. "My grandfather wanted the diner to help people," Victoria said. "We may as well keep the promise properly." Ethan looked around at the crowded booths and the quiet sense of safety in the room. "You have done something good," Victoria smiled. "You opened the door first." A tired family entered from the highway, uncertain whether the kitchen was still serving. Maria called from the pass-through. "The table by the window is open. Sit down before the coffee gets offended." The parents laughed and led their child toward the booth. Another traveler had found warmth. Another story had reached the diner. Victoria looked through the front window at the snow-bright mountains. "My grandfather would have liked this." Ethan nodded. "I think he would." Beside the entrance hung a wooden plaque Frank had carved. Iron Mesa Diner. Established 1979. Reopened by Ethan Walker and Shadow. Shadow rose, stretched, and walked to his familiar place beside the door. He sat facing the highway, watching the road as evening settled across Pine Hollow. Travelers would come. Storms would return. Some people would arrive hungry, some frightened, and some carrying wounds no stranger could see. Iron Mesa Diner would remain a place where the lights stayed on and the door opened before questions were asked. The neon sign flickered to life above the valley, and beside the entrance sat the German shepherd who had guided a broken veteran toward home, only to discover that the veteran had become a guide for others. If this story stayed with you, share in the comments whether a loyal animal has ever helped someone you love through a difficult season. Tell us where you are watching from today. For more stories about veterans, loyal dogs, second chances, and courage in life's coldest moments, subscribe and join us for the next journey. Somewhere tonight, another road is carrying someone toward the place they will finally call home.